Look at her, gentlemen, collecting our brass like some kind of battlefield magpie. Ma'am, this isn't a souvenir shop. This is the high-angle marksmanship center. The big leagues. We're operating on a level I doubt you could even comprehend. The voice, laced with the easy arrogance of a mid-level instructor who had mistaken competence for mastery, belonged to Staff Sergeant Renner. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the lone figure moving quietly at the edge of the firing line. The small crowd of army marksmen, all sinew and swagger, chuckled in that complicit way men do when they want to belong. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her movements were economical, a quiet study in efficiency as she collected spent casings, her fingers gently plucking the warm brass from the dusty ground. She moved with a practiced grace that was utterly at odds with Renner's caricature of a clueless civilian. Her posture was perfect, a straight line from her heels to the crown of her head, a discipline so ingrained it was as natural as breathing. But when the visiting colonel, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten conflicts, saw the precise way she knelt, the way her center of gravity remained perfectly balanced, a flicker of something other than amusement crossed his features. It was recognition. It was a ghost of a memory. If you believe true professionalism is defined by what you do, not what you say, type competence below. The challenge had been laid down, not by the woman, but by the universe itself. The target, a steel silhouette no bigger than a man's torso, sat glinting under the brutal Colorado sun at 3,500 meters. An impossible distance. A shot that was more theoretical than practical. A number thrown out to separate the legends from the merely excellent. The atmospheric conditions were a sniper's nightmare. A fickle, swirling wind that played tricks with the heat mirage rising from the baked earth. The elite shooters of the 10th Special Forces Group had been trying all morning, their 338 Lapua and 408 Chatak rounds, guided by millions of dollars of technology and decades of training, falling short, drifting wide, or simply disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and frustration. The quiet woman finished her task, the brass clicking softly in the small canvas bag she carried. She rose, her gaze sweeping over the controlled chaos of the range, her expression unreadable. Renner, emboldened by the laughter and his own perceived authority, couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "You seem to know your way around an empty shell. How about a full one? Want to show all these trained killers how it's done?" He gestured grandly to the M210 enhanced sniper rifle resting on the bipod in his lane, a state-of-the-art weapon system that was as much a computer as it was a firearm. "Go on. Don't be shy. It's just like in the movies, right? Just point and click." The humiliation was palpable, a heavy blanket that settled over the firing line. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze, others smirking. They saw a civilian, an outsider, a woman in a place of hypermasculine performance. Their assumptions were a wall, thick and impenetrable. She, however, remained an island of calm in a sea of judgment. She looked at Renner, then at the rifle, then at the impossibly distant target. Her silence was not one of fear or intimidation. It was the silence of assessment. It was the silence of a professional calculating variables. To the onlookers, it was weakness. To the old colonel watching from the shade of the command tower, it was the sound of a storm gathering. He had seen that silence before, in the eyes of men who were about to do something extraordinary. The tension on the range became a living thing, coiling in the oppressive heat. Every eye was now fixed on the woman. Renner's sarcastic challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down not just to her, but to the very idea of her presence. He expected her to blush, to stammer, to retreat in the face of his public mockery. It was a power play, a classic assertion of dominance designed to reinforce the established hierarchy. But her response was not what anyone anticipated. She didn't speak. She simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of acceptance, but of acknowledgement, as if he had just confirmed a variable in a complex equation she was already solving. She walked toward Renner's position, her steps measured and deliberate. The sound of her boots on the gravel was the only noise in the suddenly hushed environment. The smirks on the faces of the other marksmen began to fade, replaced by a confused curiosity. Her complete lack of reaction was unsettling. It defied the social script. She wasn't playing the part of the humiliated victim. She was playing a different game entirely, one whose rules they did not understand. She stopped at the firing mat next to the M210. She didn't immediately lie down. Instead, she stood for a long moment, her eyes scanning the vast distance, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to the wind itself. She wasn't just looking at the target. She was reading the very air between here and there, decoding the invisible currents and temperature gradients that would influence the bullet's long journey. She took off the simple baseball cap she was wearing, letting the sun catch the strands of her tightly bound hair. Then, with a fluidity that was almost shocking in its precision, she lowered herself to the mat. It was not the awkward flop of a novice. It was a single, seamless motion, a practiced settling of bone and muscle into a platform of perfect stability. She became part of the earth. Her hands, which had been so gentle in collecting the casings, moved over the rifle with an intimate familiarity. She didn't look at the controls. Her fingers found them by touch alone. She adjusted the stock, the cheek weld, the bipod, making micro-adjustments that were invisible to the untrained eye but spoke volumes to the few who knew what to look for. The old colonel leaned forward, his binoculars trained on her. He saw it then, the absolute economy of her movement, the lack of any wasted energy, any hesitation. It was the hallmark of someone for whom this was not a challenge, but a return to a natural state. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And why did she move as if the most advanced sniper rifle in the Army's arsenal was a simple extension of her own body? The demonstration of skill began not with a bang, but with a whisper of movement. Her hands were a blur of practiced, methodical efficiency. She didn't ask for data from the Kestrel weather meter or the ballistic computer. She ignored the advanced tools the other shooters had been relying on all day. Instead, she reached into the small canvas bag at her side, the same bag she had been using to collect brass, and pulled out not a souvenir, but a single hand-loaded cartridge. The projectile was long and perfectly seated, the brass polished to a dull gleam. She held it for a moment, rolling it between her thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight, its balance. It was a ritual, ancient and personal. With a deft flick, she slid the bolt of the M210 back, the sound a sharp, metallic snick in the profound silence. She placed the round into the chamber, not forcing it but guiding it home. She pushed the bolt forward and locked it down with a quiet, solid thud. The rifle was now a part of her. She settled behind the optic, her eye finding the perfect relief instantly. Her breathing, which had been steady, now changed. It deepened, slowed, and fell into a rhythm. Inhale for 5 counts. Exhale for 5 counts. A pause in the natural respiratory cycle. It was the cadence of a true master, a technique for achieving absolute stillness at the moment of truth. The other shooters watched, their skepticism now warring with a growing sense of awe. They saw her left hand, not gripping the rifle, but resting gently beneath the stock, her fingers creating a stable V-shape. They saw her right index finger find the trigger, resting on it with the lightness of a feather. These are not the actions of an amateur. This was the liturgy of the long-range professional. She made a final, tiny adjustment to the scope's elevation turret, the clicks barely audible. She wasn't guessing. She was calculating, drawing on a library of knowledge written in wind and lead, in heat and barometric pressure. She was doing in her head what powerful computers had failed to do all morning. Then, she became utterly still. The world seemed to shrink, collapsing into the narrow tube of her scope. There was only her, the rifle, the air, and the distant sliver of steel. The climax action was a masterpiece of anticlimax. There was no dramatic pause, no shouted command. In the quiet space between one heartbeat and the next, she pressed the trigger. The rifle didn't so much roar as crack, a sharp, authoritative sound that ripped through the air and echoed off the distant hills. The recoil was absorbed seamlessly into her shoulder, her body a perfect shock absorber. The rifle barely moved. I never left the scope, her focus remaining downrange, watching for the telltale sign of impact. For 7 long seconds, there was nothing. The bullet was on its own, a tiny messenger on a journey of over 2 miles, fighting against gravity and the capricious whims of the wind. The crowd held its collective breath. 7 seconds felt like an eternity. Renner allowed a small, triumphant smirk to form on his lips. A miss. Of course it was a miss. It had to be. And then it happened. A flash. A tiny spark of light from the distant target, visible even to the naked eye. It was followed, a moment later, by a sound. A faint, high-pitched ping, carried back on the wind like a ghost's whisper. Impact. A direct hit. The aftermath was a silence more profound and deafening than any explosion. The shooters stood frozen, their mouths agape. The instructors stared at the spotting scopes, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The impossible had just happened. They had witnessed a miracle of ballistics, a shot that defied the known limits of their craft. Renner's smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of shock. His arrogance, so loud and confident only moments before, had been shattered by a single, perfectly placed round. "No way," he whispered, the words barely audible. That's not possible." He fumbled for his own spotting scope, swinging it toward the target, his hands trembling slightly. He focused the lens, twisting the knob with frantic energy. The image swam into view. There on the steel silhouette was a single, clean hole. Not graze, not a glancing blow. A perfect, dead-center punch, right through the heart of the target. He had witnessed a ghost. He had seen a legend born. The silence on the firing line stretched, taut and heavy, until it was finally broken by the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Colonel Vance descended from the command tower, his face grim and purposeful. He walked not toward Staff Sergeant Renner, but directly to the woman who was now calmly extracting the spent casing from the M210. She held the still-hot brass in her palm, her expression as serene as ever. Vance stopped in front of her. The entire range held its breath, expecting a reprimand, an explanation, anything to make sense of the impossible event they had just witnessed. The colonel did not speak. Instead, he simply looked at the en-bloc clip holding her identification. His eyes, accustomed to scanning battlefield reports and personnel files, widened almost imperceptibly. He knew. In that single, silent moment, he understood everything. He turned to his aide. "Get me your file," he commanded, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. Now, the aide scrambled to a nearby laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The hushed whispers started among the marksmen. They were replaying the event in their minds, analyzing every movement she had made, the way she read the wind without instruments, the way she adjusted the scope with such confidence. The single, hand-loaded round. These were not the hallmarks of a hobbyist. They were the tradecraft of a phantom, a Tier 1 operator from a world they only heard stories about. The aide returned, holding the tablet like a sacred text. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you need to see this." The reveal scene unfolded with the solemnity of a court-martial. Colonel Vance took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. The name was Lena Morgan, but it was the lines of text below her name that caused him to draw a sharp breath. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers, finally landing on the pale, stunned face of Staff Sergeant Renner. "You," Vance said, his voice cold and hard as steel, "have been teaching marksmanship for 6 years. You've qualified as an expert 3 times. You believe you stand at the pinnacle of your profession." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This woman, who you just publicly humiliated, has forgotten more about ballistics than you will ever know." He tapped the screen of the tablet. The narrator's voice now took on a staccato, impactful cadence, listing credentials that were the stuff of legend. "Name, Morgan Lena. Unit, classified. formerly assigned to the Asymmetric Warfare Group, Special Missions Unit. Call sign Ghost. Combat hours, over 4,000. Medals, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with V for Valor, and the Deadeye Medal for marksmanship under extreme duress. The list went on, a litany of quiet heroism and unparalleled skill. Mission classifications, Top Secret / Tier 1. Served in every theater of operations you've only read about. She was the lead instructor for the Jedburgh program, training elite foreign commandos in extreme long-range interdiction. The M210 rifle you're so proud of? She helped write the operational manual for it. A wave of shock and shame washed over the crowd. They hadn't just insulted a civilian. They had insulted a living legend, a quiet professional whose service record read like a modern-day epic. The validator's gesture was swift and profound. Colonel Vance, a man who had commanded battalions in combat and rarely showed deference to anyone, took a half-step back. He straightened his shoulders, brought his heels together, and rendered the sharpest, most formal salute of his career. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with a respect that bordered on reverence. "My apologies for the unprofessional conduct of my men. It is an honor to have you on my range." The validator's dialogue was a final, cutting indictment of their ignorance. "Let me be clear for everyone here," Vance continued, his voice ringing with authority as he addressed the stunned onlookers. "You are not looking at a souvenir collector. You're looking at one of the finest snipers this country has ever produced. The reason you've never heard of her is because people at her level don't boast. They don't need to. Their competence is their credential. They prove their worth with results, not with words. The shot she just made wasn't luck. It was a Tuesday. Staff Sergeant Renner, you will personally apologize to Master Sergeant Morgan. Then you will report to me for reassignment. You're going to learn a lesson about assumptions and respect, and you're going to learn it the hard way." The name hung in the air, Master Sergeant. She wasn't a civilian after all. She was one of them, but from a higher, more rarefied echelon. The legend of the 3,500-meter shot spread through Fort Carson like wildfire. It was told in hushed tones in the barracks that night, whispered over beers in the NCO club, and debated on encrypted military forums across the globe. The story grew with each telling, acquiring the burnished patina of myth. They said she hadn't used a scope, that she'd sighted down the barrel. They said she had calculated the Coriolis effect in her head while blindfolded. The fictions were wild, but they all orbited a single, undeniable truth. They had witnessed a level of mastery they hadn't known was possible, and it had come from the most unassuming source imaginable. Staff Sergeant Renner's transformation was painful but necessary. The next morning, he found Master Sergeant Morgan by the armory, where she was quietly cleaning the M210 she had used, treating the weapon with the care a surgeon affords their instruments. He stood before her, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a raw, humbling shame. "Master Sergeant," he began, his voice cracking slightly. There's no excuse for my behavior yesterday. I was arrogant. I was unprofessional. I was wrong. I am truly sorry." Lena Morgan paused her work. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and devoid of malice. She didn't offer absolution or condemnation. She simply nodded once. "Learn from it, Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Respect is earned in silence, not demanded with noise, that was all." She returned to her work, her message delivered with the same precision as her shot. Renner stood there for a long moment, the weight of her simple words pressing down on him more heavily than any official punishment. He had been so focused on the superficial, her gender, her quiet demeanor, his own status, that he had failed to see the substance right in front of him. It was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his career. The protagonist remained humble, a quiet center in the storm of her own newfound fame. She deflected praise, turning conversations about her shot into teachable moments about fundamentals. She was sought out by the younger shooters, not because she was a legend, but because she was approachable. She would stand with them on the line, offering quiet advice not on complex ballistics, but on the importance of breathing, of a stable position, of patience. Her philosophy was simple. Mastery isn't a destination. It's a process of constant, quiet refinement. A symbolic artifact of the event was soon created. The single, perfect casing from the 3,500-meter shot was mounted on a small wooden plaque by the rangemaster. Underneath it, a simple brass plate was engraved with the date, the distance, and 2 words. Competence is quiet. The plaque was hung on the wall of the main instruction building, a permanent reminder for every soldier who passed through. And out on the range, firing point 7, where she had taken a shot, was unofficially but universally renamed. The soldiers just called it Morgan's Perch. A few weeks later, a new class of sniper candidates was gathered on that same range. Colonel Vance stood before them, the sun casting long shadows in the early morning light. He didn't begin with a technical lecture on windage or elevation. Instead, he pointed to the plaque on the wall. He told them the story of Master Sergeant Lena Morgan. He spoke of her silence, her precision, and her profound humility. He described the arrogance she faced and the undeniable competence with which she answered it. The story had already become institutional folklore, a foundational parable for every new marksman. It was no longer just about a remarkable shot. It was a lesson in the core values of the quiet professional. The tale was now a teaching tool, used to strip away the ego and prejudice of new recruits and refocus them on what truly mattered: skill, discipline, and respect. It taught them to look beyond the uniform, beyond the rank, beyond the gender, and to recognize excellence wherever it was found. The legacy of that day was not the hole in a piece of steel 2 miles away. It was the change in the culture of the institution itself. The time jump of several months sees a different atmosphere at the High-Angle Marksmanship Center. The casual arrogance has been replaced by a more focused, professional humility. The instructors, especially the new ones who replaced Renner, now emphasize observation and mutual respect as much as they do technical skill. They begin their first day briefs by telling the story of Morgan's Perch, using it to set a new standard. The narrative has become a part of the very identity of the place, a reminder that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is often the one you overlook. The legend of Lena Morgan became a touchstone, a moral compass for a generation of soldiers. Her name was never officially put on any monument. Her face never appeared in any recruitment posters. That wasn't her way. Her legacy was quieter, more profound. It lived in the changed attitudes of the men on that range. It lived in the focus of the new students who heard her story. It lived in the small plaque that reminded everyone that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in monuments of stone. It's what continues forward in the actions and beliefs of others. It is the quiet competence that inspires more quiet competence, a chain of excellence passed down not through orders, but through example. Her single shot did more than hit a target. It corrected a course, reminding an entire institution that skill knows no gender, professionalism has no volume, and respect is a currency earned not by the loudness of your voice, but by the precision of your actions. The world is full of noise, of people clamoring for attention, for validation, for recognition. They shout their accomplishments from the rooftops, believing that volume equates to value. But the true masters, the quiet professionals like Lena Morgan, understand a more profound truth. They know that competence speaks for itself. They know that a whisper of undeniable skill can silence a chorus of arrogant assumptions. They operate in the spaces between the words, in the realm of pure action, where results are the only language that matters. The lesson of Morgan's Perch is not about marksmanship. It is a universal principle for life. It is a call to focus on the craft, not the credit. It is a reminder to be the person whose actions are so loud that their words can afford to be quiet. It is the understanding that the deepest respect is reserved for those who do the work, who master the details, and who let their performance be their only proclamation. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent precision defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.